Christ is risen.
Christ is risen indeed.
Christ is risen.
Christ is risen indeed.
I'd like to welcome everyone to Journey Road Ministries Easter Sunday 2020 celebration. I am the Reverend Cheryl Butler, and the tomb was empty, just as most of our churches are today, but we are here not to celebrate the tomb, but to celebrate the risen Christ. So one of the things I would like to invite you all, according to your traditions, to join us with communion later. And so during our opening hymn, if you'd like to take some time and gather whatever elements are meaningful for you, either whether it's wine and bread or tea and crackers or even grapes and chocolate, whichever is meaningful to your tradition. So I'd like to start us out with some prayer. Most loving God, we are thankful to be able to gather today and for the technology that allows us to connect from our different remote locations. We want to remember those who are struggling with life's challenges, and there are certainly so many new challenges we face today with the great isolation and the fears surrounding the pandemic. We ask for strength and courage for those who are on the front lines of this pandemic, those who are giving their time and often their lives in the service to helping others. We pray for our whole world. This is global pandemic has made the world even smaller. That we are all citizens of this world, and we are all connected. I pray that when we come out of this time of isolation, that we do not return to the old ways, but that we might have learned something more of love and compassion, and that we might learn some new ways of how we can care for our planet and for each other, and that we can be better stewards of the many gifts that we've been given. And as we come together today to celebrate the risen Christ and the gift that God has given us, let us rejoice. Let us pray the prayer that Jesus continues to teach us. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive our debts as we forgive our debtors. And leave us not in temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. So today our message is going to be brought to us by the Reverend Mary Dyer.
Ready. The gospel today is taken from Mark chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary of Magdala, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices with which to go and anoint him. And very early in the morning, on the first day of the week, they went to the tomb when the sun had risen. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for the entrance to the tomb?" But when they looked, they saw that the stone, which is very big, had already been rolled back. On entering the tomb, they saw a young man in a white robe seated on the right-hand side, and they were struck with amazement. But he said to them, "There is no need to be so amazed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See, here is the place they laid him. But you must go and tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. That is where you will see him, just as I told you." And the women came out and ran away from the tomb because they were frightened out of their wits. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. I am a liturgical rebel. That is not the liturgical reading of the resurrection of Christ for this season, which would have been Matthew. And I'm going to start off in a rather strange place, but bear with me. I actually hate most Christmas creches. Most people may have one in their home and use that as a way to focus on the Advent season and the coming of Jesus. But the shepherds and the magi should not be together. Sometimes even the little drummer boy is thrown in. And they shouldn't be together because there are two different stories from Matthew and Luke about the birth of Jesus. There are 4 canonical Gospels, but only Matthew and Luke actually write about them. And these two supposed apostles, Matthew and Luke, really are pseudonyms. These Gospels were not actually in writing and seen by the greater part of the church until at least 80 Common Era, which means basically that they simply could not have been alive at the birth of Jesus 50 years before that. So let's just see how each one of them puts their own twist on the story. For Luke is, among other things, called the Gospel of the Poor. So it's not surprising that the people that come to worship the babe in the manger in Bethlehem are shepherds walking in from their sheep herds, possibly even with sheep dung on their sandals, bringing nothing but their adoration. Matthew, written about the same time, was specifically trying to talk to the fellow Jews to convince them that Jesus is actually the Christ that was foreshadowed in the Hebrew Scriptures. And so, sort of as a slam to them and their lack of belief, he brings in magi, wise men from another country, from another religion, bringing their offerings of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. He's trying to show them that even people of another region of the world and of another religion are able to see what the recalcitrant Jews are not able to see right in front of them. So I'm really not the Christmas Grinch, but I want you to understand from the stories that you're familiar with around the Advent that there are two different understandings of what the birth of Jesus means, and there were two different groups of people that these two writers were trying to bring to the awareness of the Christ child. It's the same in the Easter narratives. The difference is all four of the narratives have a story of the resurrection of Jesus. The one in Matthew is perhaps the most colorful. They have Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. They go to the tomb. There's an earthquake. An angel comes and rolls away the stone. Jesus is risen, but then to prove it, Jesus actually shows up in person. It reminds me of how Cecil B. DeMille treated the Ten Commandments. There's nothing small about this story. It is written and produced for the big screen. Luke is a contemporary of Matthew, also another pseudonymous author. We don't really know who Matthew and Luke actually were. And for him, it's not quite as grand, but there's the stone rolled away, the baby gone, the body gone, two men sitting at the head and the foot of the place where Jesus had been laid, and they speak of the resurrection. And John is possibly the simplest. His was not even written until probably 100 Common Era, which makes it about 70 years after the birth. All he speaks about is the stone being rolled away and the tomb being empty. Mark, the earliest gospel, possibly written around 70 Common Era, right before or right after the destruction of the temple, is the one that I want to go to first. And that was the reading that I used today. You may have noticed how I stopped with, and the women came out and ran away from the tomb because they were frightened out of their wits. And they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. We're really not used to that ending. We're possibly uncomfortable with it. And so was anyone that was reading and hearing that short story of the first gospel that we have. And so, much later, some anonymous author tacked on the happily ever after story that we're celebrating today. But it seems to me that today in this country, both with the pandemic tracking everyone down and the total ineptness of the federal government to handle this with foresight and compassion and accurate knowledge, this is the one I want to focus on today. Isn't this where really many of us really are today, despite all of the happy songs and the celebratory emails and possibly watching something else on television? We're really, when it gets down to it, frightened out of our wits, for good reason. How many of us are actually sheltering in place? We have been doing that, going out for a shortening list of essential needs. We have masks and we have gloves and an increasingly shorter list of essential needs as the destruction and the death tolls mount and spread across the country. We have hoarded food and even hoarded toilet paper. That was my idea. In retrospect, I was right. And obsessively checking with anyone we know several times a day, our family members, our friends, to reassure one another that we're still all right. And so far, knock on wood, we're out of harm's way. Some of us are still obsessively worried about that magic check that is supposed to show up for everyone to help us in the short term for something that may last a very, very long time and whose scope has not yet even been figured out. Some of us have been laid off without cause. Others have been fired. Some of us are worried about paying our mortgage or for our rent. There's a lack of desperately needed medical equipment that we hear about every day. And so that is what we have. We have the story of Easter on one side, and then we have all of the things that the entire country, the entire world actually is going through right now. So I turned for some sort of insight to John, his first pastoral letter, where he proclaims in no uncertain terms, in love there is no room for fear, but perfect love casts out fear. I've pondered about and wrestled with that particular text for many years. And today, I'm going to be honest, I have not cast out all my fear. What does that mean? Does that mean I'm not a good Christian, that I don't really believe in the ways of Jesus? But like Mark's gospel, today I'm standing in front of that empty tomb, confused and literally scared out of my wits, and I don't know what to preach or if I should just hide or run away. But I've been looking for heroes. I actually searched my own life to find some point in my life, and there have been many where I have actually done something loving and when I still had fear, and it didn't stop me from doing the loving thing. And instead of using some minor incident in my own life, I've been thinking very deeply about and pondering on and thinking about the hospital workers right now. Every day, they are our new soldiers. There are no guns, there are no insignia, there are no uniforms, there are no awards given for bravery like the Medal of Honor or the Purple Heart, but every day, knowing they're facing an unknown and deadly adversary that they can't even see, they go in to the war zone without enough equipment, watching colleagues get sick, watching colleagues die. Many, many thousands have come out of retirement or have canceled vacation plans to volunteer to come in to help those that have COVIDs. And it's a time when even the family cannot be with those people, even the ones that are dying. Last night I watched a nurse on TV talking about what it was like to sit next to someone who was dying and to be present for that person when the family couldn't be there. I watched another nurse talk about how she actually had to send her children away to live with a relative because she was so afraid that they would contact the COVID's virus from her. And I saw the tears come and the hopelessness rise in their eyes, but they kept going in every day. And so I take courage from them. Not that someday I'll miraculously just do loving things without any fear, but to realize that today my task is simply to stand at the empty tomb, still confused, still wondering, still scared out of my wits. But I still stand there and hope. I stand there and know that ultimately love always wins.
I'd like to welcome everyone to the Lord's table. In the disciples' tradition, everyone is welcome. We believe this is not our table or the church's table, but it's God's table, and God's invitation is to everyone. And so feel welcome to participate as your tradition allows. You know, when I was younger, there were times when I would not take communion because I felt unworthy. I had been sinful in some way. But as I've gotten older, I've learned that this meal isn't about my worthiness or our worthiness or our perfection, It's about God's welcoming. It's about God's love and God's grace. And so this is what the table represents for us, the welcoming grace of God. A place where we can all partake as children, that we're all children of God. And so we'll ask a blessing on this bread and on this drink, that we might remember the sacrifice that was made, that Jesus made when he went to that cross. And remember the sacrifice that so many in the world today are making. And remember the first responders, people that are at the grocery stores and the pharmacies and that are keeping our basic lives going. And that we are grateful for the gifts that we are to receive. And so when we come to this table, we remember as Jesus gathered in that room with his disciples, that he called friends, that he took the bread and he blessed it and he broke it. And as he gave it to them, he said, "Eat. This is my body broken for you. Whenever you gather in my name, remember me." And likewise, taking the cup, blessing it, saying, "This is the cup of the new covenant, my blood poured out for all of you. Whenever you gather in my name and drink this cup, remember me." And so I invite everyone to this table that so represents God's great love. The bread of life for you. And the cup of hope.
One bread, one body, one Lord of all, one cup of blessing which we bless, and we, though many, throughout the earth, we are one body in this one Lord. Gentile or Jew, servant or free, woman or man, no more one bread.
joining us today. We'd love to invite you to check out our website, journeyroadministries.org. You'll find other videos and some ponderings. Invite any questions, conversation you might have. Please let us know if you have any prayer requests, and we would love to pray for you. I know it's very challenging right now in this time of social isolation. So please feel free to contact us. We'd love to hear from you, and we could have a conversation. So during this time of isolation, and please be safe and be well. May God bless you and keep you along your journey. Amen.